Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The humid evening air of Manila carried the familiar sounds of tricycles rumbling through narrow streets, vendors calling out their final sales of the day, and children playing in small courtyards between concrete buildings. Manny Pacquiao walked quietly through the bustling neighborhood of Malate, his baseball cap pulled low, and a simple gray hoodie concealing his identity from the crowds that would otherwise swarm him within seconds. This was his ritual now, these solitary walks through the communities that reminded him of his own humble beginnings. After decades of fame, fortune, and global recognition, these moments of anonymity had become precious to him. The weight of constant attention, the pressure of being a national hero, and the endless demands on his time made these quiet evening strolls feel like stolen treasures. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows between the tightly packed houses and small businesses that lined the street. Street food vendors were beginning to pack up their stalls, the aroma of grilled fish and steamed rice still lingering in the air. Manny inhaled deeply, remembering countless evenings from his childhood when such smells meant the difference between eating and going to bed hungry. As he turned down a quieter side street, away from the main thoroughfare, Manny noticed how the atmosphere shifted. The cheerful chatter of the busy road gave way to a more subdued energy. Older residents sat on plastic chairs outside their homes, fanning themselves and watching the world go by with the patient wisdom that comes from years of observing life's endless cycles. It was then that he saw her. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, struggled with a heavy plastic bag filled with groceries as she slowly made her way down the uneven sidewalk. Her weathered hands gripped the handles tightly, and Manny could see the strain in her posture as she paused every few steps to catch her breath. She wore a faded floral dress that had clearly seen many years of faithful service, and her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun secured with a worn elastic band. Something about her reminded Manny powerfully of his own mother, Dionysia. The same determined set of the shoulders, the same refusal to show weakness despite obvious fatigue. He had seen that exact expression countless times during his childhood, when his mother would work tirelessly to provide for their family, never complaining, never asking for help, always pushing forward with quiet dignity. The woman continued her slow progress, unaware that one of the most famous athletes in Philippine history was watching her with growing concern. Manny felt an instinctive urge to approach and offer assistance, but he hesitated. His experiences had taught him that even simple acts of kindness could quickly become complicated when his identity was revealed. Camera phones would appear, crowds would gather, and what should be a private moment of human connection would transform into a public spectacle. As these thoughts crossed his mind, Manny noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Two young men had emerged from a narrow alley between buildings, their movements purposeful and predatory. They wore loose clothing and kept their heads down, but there was something in their body language that immediately triggered alarm bells in Manny's mind. Years of training had sharpened his instincts for reading people and situations, and every fiber of his being was now telling him that danger was approaching. The elderly woman remained focused on her struggle with the heavy groceries, completely unaware of the threat developing behind her. The two men quickened their pace, closing the distance with calculated precision. Their intentions became crystal clear as they positioned themselves to intercept her path just ahead, where the street curved and would be hidden from the view of potential witnesses on the main road. Manny's muscles tensed as his protective instincts fully activated. Time seemed to slow as Manny watched the two men approach the elderly woman with unmistakable criminal intent. Every instinct honed through decades of boxing training screamed at him to act, but his mind quickly calculated the situation. The narrow street offered limited escape routes, and the woman's frail condition meant she would be completely defenseless against two younger, stronger attackers. Without hesitation, Manny broke into a silent sprint, his years of athletic conditioning allowing him to close the distance with remarkable speed while maintaining stealth. His footsteps were deliberately light against the cracked concrete, a skill he had developed during his impoverished youth, when sometimes survival meant moving undetected through dangerous neighborhoods. The first attacker, a lean young man with multiple tattoos covering his arms, reached for the elderly woman's grocery bag just as she turned the corner. His companion, stockier and wearing a faded basketball jersey, positioned himself to block any potential escape route. The woman's eyes widened in terror as she realized what was happening, but her aged legs wouldn't allow her to flee. Manny struck with the precision and power that had made him a legend in boxing rings around the world. His first punch connected with the tattooed man's solar plexus, a perfectly placed blow that immediately dropped the would-be robber to his knees, gasping for air. The impact was swift and clinical, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. The second attacker spun around in shock, his mouth falling open as he recognized the unmistakable features of the Filipino boxing icon. For a moment, pure disbelief froze him in place. This was Manny Pacquiao, the pride of the Philippines, the man whose face appeared on billboards and television screens across the country, standing before him in a quiet Manila side street. But Manny's expression carried no trace of the warm smile that fans were accustomed to seeing. His eyes held the cold intensity of a fighter who had faced the world's most dangerous opponents, and his stance radiated the controlled violence of someone capable of ending confrontations in seconds. The stocky man's shock quickly transformed into panic, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a small pothole in the uneven pavement. His survival instincts overcame any thoughts of continuing the robbery, and he grabbed his gasping companion by the arm, hauling him to his feet with desperate urgency. Both men fled down the alley from which they had emerged, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls as they disappeared into the maze of back streets that crisscrossed this part of Manila. Manny made no attempt to pursue them. His concern now focused entirely on the elderly woman who stood trembling beside a weathered wooden fence, her groceries scattered across the ground where she had dropped them in terror. The woman's hands shook as she looked up at her unexpected savior, recognition slowly dawning in her tired eyes. She had lived through enough decades to understand that miracles sometimes came in the most unexpected forms, but never had she imagined that the greatest boxer in Philippine history would appear in her moment of greatest need. Manny immediately knelt down to gather her scattered groceries, his movements gentle and respectful. Rice grains had spilled from a torn plastic bag, and several small cans of sardines had rolled into the gutter. He carefully collected each item, treating her modest purchases with the same reverence he might show to precious artifacts. As he worked, Manny's mind wandered to his mother, Dionysia, who had struggled through similar neighborhoods during his childhood, often carrying groceries just like these while worrying about whether she would make it home safely. The parallel was so strong it created a physical ache in his chest, a reminder of how precarious life remained for so many Filipino families despite his own rise to international fame. The woman watched in amazement as one of the most famous people in the Philippines carefully salvaged her simple groceries, his actions speaking volumes about the character that fame and fortune had never corrupted. As Manny carefully placed the last can of sardines back into the elderly woman's plastic bag, he could feel her intense gaze studying his face. The initial shock of the robbery attempt was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of who had come to her rescue. Her weathered hands trembled slightly, but now it was from emotion rather than fear. The woman's name was Esperanza, though Manny would not learn this until much later. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, raising 6 children in a small apartment above the corner bakery. She had watched countless boxing matches on the old television in her local sari-sari store, cheering for the young fighter from General Santos, who had captured the hearts of every Filipino. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that same fighter would one day save her from danger on this quiet street. Manny stood slowly, extending the repaired grocery bag toward her with both hands, a gesture of respect deeply ingrained in Filipino culture. His movements remained calm and gentle, understanding that the woman was still processing the traumatic experience. The fading daylight cast long shadows across her lined face, and he could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. The recognition in her expression was unmistakable now. Her mouth opened slightly in amazement, and she brought one trembling hand to her chest in the universal gesture of surprise. For a moment, she seemed unable to process that Manny Pacquiao, the 8-division world champion, the pride of the Philippines, was standing before her in this ordinary neighborhood street, holding her humble groceries. Manny felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same emotion that always surfaced when he encountered people who reminded him of his roots. This woman could have been any of the countless mothers, grandmothers, and elderly neighbors who had struggled to survive in the poverty-stricken areas where he had grown up. Her simple dignity, her quiet strength in the face of adversity, and her genuine gratitude all reflected the character of the Filipino people who had supported him throughout his career. The boxer's mind drifted to memories of his own childhood, when his family had often depended on the kindness of neighbors during their darkest moments. He remembered elderly women just like Esperanza, who had shared what little they had, offering spoonfuls of rice or small coins when his family faced hunger. These acts of generosity had taught him that true wealth was not measured in pesos or championship belts, but in the willingness to help others when they needed it most. As these thoughts flowed through his consciousness, Manny noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Around the woman's neck hung a small tarnished silver medal, barely visible beneath her worn collar. It was a religious medallion, similar to one his own mother had worn throughout his childhood, a symbol of faith that had sustained countless Filipino families through generations of hardship. The sight of that simple piece of jewelry transported him instantly to his mother's kitchen in General Santos, where Dionysia would pray before every meal, no matter how meager. He could almost smell the rice cooking on the small stove, hear his siblings playing in the cramped room they all shared, feel the mixture of love and desperation that had defined those early years. Esperanza's eyes continued to study his face, and Manny could see the exact moment when complete recognition dawned. Her expression transformed from confusion to wonder, to overwhelming gratitude. She began to bow slightly, the automatic response of someone raised to show respect to those who had achieved greatness, but Manny gently gestured for her to remain upright. In that gesture, he communicated something profound about his character. Despite his fame, despite his wealth, despite the millions of people who revered him around the world, he still saw himself as a son of the Philippines, no different from the elderly woman standing before him. The humility that had defined his personality long before his first professional fight remained unchanged by decades of success. The street around them remained quiet, but Manny sensed that this encounter was far from over. Esperanza's weathered hands reached into a small pocket of her faded dress, withdrawing a crumpled piece of newspaper that had clearly been folded and unfolded countless times. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges worn soft from years of handling. She carefully opened it, revealing a photograph that made Manny's breath catch in his throat. It was a picture of him from nearly 20 years ago, taken after his first major victory in the United States. He was younger then, his face unmarked by the battles that would follow, his smile radiant with the joy of a dream fulfilled. But what stunned him was not the photograph itself, but the careful way it had been preserved, as if it were a treasured family heirloom. The elderly woman's eyes glistened with tears as she gazed at the faded image, then back at the man standing before her. In that moment, Manny understood that this was not simply a case of a fan meeting her hero. There was something deeper here, something that connected them in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Around the photograph, Manny could see that other newspaper clippings had been carefully folded into the same piece of paper. Headlines in Tagalog spoke of his various victories, his rise from poverty to international stardom, his representation of Filipino pride on the world stage. Each article had been cut out with meticulous care, saved and cherished by someone who saw his success as more than entertainment. As Manny looked more closely at Esperanza's face, illuminated now by the soft glow of a nearby street lamp that had just flickered on May, he began to notice something familiar in her features. There was something about the set of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, that triggered a distant memory. It was like looking at a reflection in still water, where the image is clear but somehow displaced. The realization hit him with the force of one of his own left hooks. This woman reminded him not just of his mother, but of someone specific from his past. His mind raced back through decades of memories, searching for the connection that his heart had already recognized. During his childhood in General Santos, there had been a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from his family's cramped dwelling, an elderly woman who would often sit outside her small home in the evenings, watching the children play in the dusty street. She had been kind to him during those hungry years, occasionally offering him small treats or a cup of rice when his own family had nothing. But that woman had moved away when Manny was still a teenager, long before his boxing career had begun to flourish. He had often wondered what had become of her, whether she had followed his journey to success, whether she remembered the skinny boy who used to run past her house on his way to the small gym where he first learned to fight. The pieces began falling into place with startling clarity. The way Esperanza had looked at him, the careful preservation of his photographs, the familiar warmth in her eyes despite the trauma she had just experienced. This was not a random encounter between a celebrity and a fan. This was a reunion that had been 20 years in the making. Esperanza seemed to sense his growing recognition, and her tears flowed more freely now. Her hands shook as she continued to hold the precious newspaper clipping, a tangible link to the boy she had once known and the man he had become. The quiet street around them seemed to fade away as Manny processed this extraordinary coincidence. Of all the neighborhoods in Manila, of all the evening walks he could have taken, he had somehow found himself on this particular street at this exact moment when the woman who had shown him kindness during his childhood needed help. The recognition crashed over Manny like a powerful wave, bringing with it a flood of memories that he thought had been buried forever beneath years of fame and success. His legs suddenly felt weak, and he had to steady himself against a nearby concrete post as the full reality of the situation washed over him. This was indeed the same woman who had lived on his childhood street in General Santos. Esperanza Santos, as he now remembered her full name, had been one of the few bright spots during the darkest period of his family's poverty. While other neighbors sometimes looked away when his family struggled, she had always acknowledged him with a warm smile and genuine concern. Manny's mind raced back to a particularly difficult evening when he was 12 years old. His father had been gone for days, leaving his mother, Dionysia, to care for 5 children with no money and no food in the house. He had been sitting outside their small home, his stomach cramping from hunger, when Esperanza had approached him, carrying a small bowl covered with a clean cloth. She had sat beside him on the concrete step without saying a word, simply placing the bowl in his hands. Inside had been a serving of rice topped with a small piece of fried fish and a few vegetables. It was not much, but to a starving boy, it had felt like a feast prepared by angels. More importantly, she had given it to him without pity or condescension, treating him with the same dignity she would show any guest in her own home. That act of kindness had been repeated many times over the following months. Sometimes it was food, other times it was a few pesos slipped quietly into his hand, and occasionally it was simply the gift of her attention when the world seemed to have forgotten that he existed. She had never asked for anything in return, never made him feel like a charity case, never treated his family's poverty as something shameful. As these memories flooded back, Manny realized that Esperanza had been one of his first teachers in the values that would later define his character. From her, he had learned that true generosity came not from abundance, but from the willingness to share whatever little one possessed. She had shown him that dignity was not dependent on wealth, and that kindness was the most valuable currency in any community. Now, 2 decades later, their roles had been reversed in the most extraordinary way imaginable. The skinny, hungry boy she had once fed was now a world-famous athlete worth millions of dollars, and she was the one in need of protection and assistance. The cosmic justice of this moment was not lost on him. Standing in this quiet Manila street, with the evening shadows growing longer around them, Manny felt a profound sense of completion. This was why he had felt compelled to take these solitary walks through neighborhoods like this one. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, he had been searching for connections to his past, for reminders of who he had been before the world knew his name. Esperanza continued to clutch the yellowed newspaper clippings, and Manny could now see that her collection included articles spanning his entire career. She had followed every fight, celebrated every victory, and probably worried through every defeat. In her simple way, she had been part of his journey from the very beginning. The elderly woman's eyes met his, and in that gaze, Manny saw not just recognition, but a profound sense of pride. It was the look of someone who had witnessed a miracle, who had seen a hungry child transform into a national hero, and who had never stopped believing in the possibility of such transformation. The weight of gratitude that Manny felt in that moment was almost overwhelming, creating a debt that could never truly be repaid. As Manny stood in the growing darkness of the Manila street, surrounded by the familiar sounds of evening settling over the neighborhood, he felt something shift deep within his soul. The encounter with Esperanza had awakened a part of him that success and fame had never quite been able to touch, the part that remembered what it meant to receive unexpected kindness when hope seemed lost. He looked at the elderly woman before him, noting details he had missed in the urgency of the robbery incident. Her shoes were worn thin at the heels, held together with careful patches that spoke of someone who made every peso count. The plastic bag containing her groceries was reused, its handles reinforced with tape to extend its life. Everything about her spoke of dignified poverty, the same kind his own family had endured for so many years. Yet despite her obvious financial struggles, Esperanza had maintained an aura of grace and strength that reminded Manny powerfully of the Filipino values he had grown up with. She had not complained about her circumstances, had not asked for help, and even after being saved from robbery, she seemed more concerned with expressing gratitude than with her own well-being. In that moment, Manny made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The idea that formed in his mind was so audacious, so far beyond what anyone might expect, that it initially shocked even him. But as he considered it more deeply, he realized that this was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been unconsciously seeking during all those solitary walks through Manila's neighborhoods. His success had always felt incomplete, without a way to meaningfully give back to the people who had shaped him during his formative years. He had established foundations and donated to charities, but those efforts, while important, had always felt somewhat impersonal. This was different. This was a chance to repay a specific debt of gratitude that had been accumulating interest in his heart for 20 years. Manny's mind began working with the same strategic precision that had made him a champion in the boxing ring. He thought about his various business investments, his real estate holdings, and the financial resources that had grown far beyond what his younger self could have ever imagined. More importantly, he thought about his responsibility as someone who had been blessed with the ability to transform lives. The plan that began forming in his thoughts was not just about financial assistance, though that would certainly be part of it. It was about creating a moment of recognition and respect for someone who had exemplified the best qualities of the Filipino spirit long before the world knew who Manny Pacquiao was. As these ideas crystallized, Manny felt a familiar surge of energy, the same feeling he had experienced before his most important fights. This was not about winning championships or earning prize money. This was about something far more valuable, the opportunity to honor someone who had planted seeds of kindness that had helped grow into the man he had become. Esperanza continued to study his face, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was developing in his mind. The yellowed newspaper clippings remained clutched in her weathered hands, tangible proof of her decades-long investment in his success, even when she had every reason to focus solely on her own survival. The street around them remained quiet, but Manny could feel the weight of destiny settling over this encounter. Sometimes life presented opportunities that demanded bold action, moments when the safe and predictable path was not enough. This was one of those moments. What he was contemplating would indeed shock everyone who heard about it, but more importantly, it would represent the kind of gesture that defined true character. Without hesitation, Manny gently took Esperanza's grocery bag and began walking beside her, his presence transforming what should have been a frightening journey home into something approaching a miracle. As they moved slowly through the narrow streets, he used the time to observe everything about her circumstances with the careful attention of someone preparing for the most important fight of his life. The route to her home led through increasingly modest neighborhoods, where small houses pressed closely together and families gathered on front steps to escape the heat trapped inside their cramped living spaces. Children played in the streets, despite the growing darkness, their laughter echoing off concrete walls decorated with faded posters and graffiti. This was the Philippines that tourists rarely saw, the authentic heart of a nation where joy and struggle existed in constant tension. Esperanza moved with the careful pace of someone whose body had endured decades of physical labor and hardship. Manny noticed how she favored her left leg slightly, probably the result of an old injury or the natural wear of a life spent standing, walking and working without the luxury of rest. Her breathing was slightly labored, and he could see that the evening's trauma had drained much of her energy. As they walked, Manny's mind continued developing the extraordinary plan that had taken shape during their encounter. He was mentally cataloging every detail about Esperanza's situation, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. What he was contemplating would require careful coordination and absolute discretion, at least initially. They passed a small sari-sari store where the owner, a middle-aged woman named Teresita, waved to Esperanza from behind her counter, stocked with basic necessities. The familiarity of that greeting told Manny that this was Esperanza's neighborhood, where she was known and respected by her neighbors. The information was valuable for what he planned to do. A few houses down, they encountered a group of teenage boys who immediately recognized Manny, despite his attempt at anonymity. Their eyes widened in amazement, but something in his expression and posture communicated that this was not the time for autographs or selfies. They respectfully stepped aside, watching in wonder as the boxing legend continued his slow progress through their neighborhood. Finally, they arrived at Esperanza's home, a small concrete structure that had clearly been built decades earlier and maintained through careful and economical repairs. The metal gate was secured with a simple padlock, and a small garden area beside the entrance contained a few hardy plants that had survived despite minimal care. Everything about the property spoke of someone who took pride in what little they had while making do with very limited resources. Manny helped Esperanza unlock her gate, noting the worn brass key and the way her arthritic fingers struggled with the mechanism. The front door beyond the gate was made of wood that had been painted multiple times over the years, each layer adding to a palimpsest of colors that told the story of decades of hopeful maintenance. As Esperanza prepared to enter her home, Manny made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of simply saying goodbye and walking away, he pulled out his mobile phone and made a call that would set in motion events that would transform not just Esperanza's life, but create a story that would inspire millions of people around the world. The voice that answered belonged to his personal assistant, someone who had learned over the years that when Manny Pacquiao had an idea that required immediate action, extraordinary things were about to happen. The conversation was brief, but packed with instructions that would have seemed impossible to anyone unfamiliar with the resources at Manny's disposal. What he was planning would indeed shock everyone, but for Esperanza, it would represent something far more valuable than shock. It would represent the kind of miracle that reminded people why kindness was the most powerful force in the universe. 3 days after the robbery incident, Esperanza woke to the sound of construction equipment outside her small home. Confused and still groggy from sleep, she peered through her window to see a scene that made her question whether she was still dreaming. A team of workers was carefully measuring her property while architects in crisp white shirts discussed plans with serious-looking contractors. The previous evening, a well-dressed woman named Rowena had knocked on her door, introducing herself as a representative of the Pacquiao Foundation. She had explained that Manny wanted to express his gratitude for Esperanza's kindness during his childhood, but the elderly woman had never imagined anything like what was unfolding before her eyes. By noon, the entire neighborhood had gathered to witness something unprecedented. Manny Pacquiao himself arrived in a simple sedan, stepping out to personally oversee what he would later describe as the most important project of his life. He had not simply decided to renovate Esperanza's home, he was completely rebuilding it from the ground up, creating a modern, comfortable house that would serve as her sanctuary for the rest of her life. But the new house was only the beginning of what would become known as the Esperanza Project. Manny had quietly researched every aspect of her life, discovering that she had been supporting 3 grandchildren whose parents had died in a tragic accident 5 years earlier. The children, ages 8, 12 and 15, had been struggling in school because they lacked basic supplies and proper study space. The new house included individual bedrooms for each grandchild, complete with study desks, bookshelves, and computer equipment that would give them opportunities Esperanza could never have afforded. Manny had also established education funds that would cover their schooling through university, ensuring that the cycle of poverty that had defined so many generations would finally be broken. As construction progressed, news of the project spread throughout the Philippines and eventually around the world. Media outlets struggled to comprehend the magnitude of Manny's gesture, not just the financial investment, which was substantial, but the personal attention he paid to every detail. He visited the construction site daily, consulting with Esperanza about her preferences, ensuring that the house reflected her personality and needs, rather than his own vision of what she should want. The story captured international attention because it represented something increasingly rare in modern celebrity culture: genuine, personal gratitude expressed through transformative action. This was not a publicity stunt or a tax-deductible donation to a faceless charity. This was one human being acknowledging a debt that had shaped his character and responding with a gesture that honored the dignity of the person who had helped him. On the day the house was completed, Manny personally handed Esperanza the keys during a small ceremony attended only by her family and closest neighbors. The moment was captured by a single photographer, whose image would become one of the most shared photographs in Philippine history. The world champion boxer kneeling respectfully before the elderly woman who had fed him when he was hungry, offering her not just a new home but recognition of her role in creating the man he had become. What shocked everyone was not just the generosity of the gesture, but its profound authenticity. In an age of calculated public relations and strategic philanthropy, Manny had acted purely from the heart, creating a story that reminded the world why true character was measured not by what someone achieved, but by how they treated those who had helped them along the way. Esperanza's grandchildren would grow up to become teachers, engineers, and doctors, carrying forward the values of kindness and gratitude that had transformed their family's destiny. And somewhere in General Santos, other elderly neighbors smiled, knowing that the hungry boy they had once helped had never forgotten where he came from. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.